The summer sun glared down like a judgmental eye, scorching the still surface of the lake and casting long golden shadows through the pine trees that framed my cabin like sentinels. The scent of cedarwood and warm earth hung thick in the air as I stood on the porch, barefoot, coffee in hand, trying to enjoy a quiet morning before the day officially began. But peace never lasts long when there's a Karen nearby, and especially not when that Karen thinks she runs the whole damn lake. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel before I saw anything, the sound sharp and out of place in this isolated corner of paradise where the only traffic should have been birds flitting between trees or maybe the occasional deer. I stepped forward, shielding my eyes from the sun as a county patrol cruiser crept down the drive, red and blue lights flashing like I'd just robbed a bank. Right behind it, purring like a smug cat, came a silver Mercedes SUV with a vanity plate that read Queen Bee. Out she came, blonde bob stiff with hairspray, oversized sunglasses hiding a permanent scowl, and a folder in her arms that I could only assume was stuffed with bylaws, citations, and whatever other HOA nonsense she'd cooked up that week. "You are in violation of Section 8.12.4 of the Occupancy Agreement," she announced before her heels even hit the gravel. "And as acting president of the Lakeside Ridge Homeowners Association, I've filed a complaint with the county. You're not allowed to reside on this property alone for more than 30 consecutive days unless approved by the board." I blinked once, twice, then sipped my coffee and said nothing because sometimes silence does more damage than any words ever could. The deputy climbed out of his cruiser slowly, clearly unsure what he was walking into, and gave me a long, assessing look. "She says you're trespassing on HOA-controlled land, sir," he said with a hesitant tone, clearly aware something didn't feel right. "She says this property's not in compliance and that you've been issued multiple cease and desist letters." I let out a breath, slow and steady, set my coffee mug down on the porch rail, and walked over to the edge of the deck, eyes locked on Karen, who was already rifling through her folder like a magician mid-trick. "This land has been in my family for 40 years, I said. "The HOA was formed 5 years ago. They tried to annex this part of the lake 2 years ago and failed. I have county documents, court orders, and boundary maps. But more importantly, I knelt and reached beneath a loose board on the porch, pulling out a small metal lockbox I hadn't needed to open in over a year. With the click of the latch and a flick of my wrist, I lifted out the leather case and flipped it open, revealing the gold-embossed credentials of a federal agent. "You're interfering with a federal officer in his private residence. That's a felony." Karen's face cracked like ice on a spring pond. Her mouth opened and closed but no sound came out. The deputy straightened instantly, eyes darting between me and the badge. "Sir," he said, instantly switching to formal mode. "I had no idea." "She didn't mention, she didn't know," I said, cutting him off. "Because she didn't ask. Because she assumed." Karen's voice returned then, shrill and shaking. "You're lying. That can't be real. You're just some squatter with a uniform. This property was supposed to be sold last year. It was in the association's redevelopment plans." I couldn't help but laugh, just once, sharp and humorless. "Redevelopment? You mean when the HOA tried to get eminent domain declared based on forged environmental surveys?" "Yeah, I saw those. I was assigned to investigate that scam last spring." Her eyes went wide then, the folder slipping from her hands and papers scattering into the dirt like panicked birds. No, this isn't how it's supposed to go," she whispered. But it was. Exactly how it was supposed to go once truth and law caught up with arrogance and entitlement. The second cruiser arrived moments later, and I watched her expression twist in real time, from righteous indignation to full-blown panic. She tried to spin a new story to the arriving officer, but it was too late. I showed them everything, the boundary maps, the case file, the badge. And as they put her in cuffs not 20 feet from where I'd sipped my coffee that morning, I realized that some mornings don't start quiet because of nature. They start quiet because justice is just stretching its arms. Most people think that if you're living in a remote lakeside cabin, you're either a reclusive writer, a retired hermit, or a guy running from something. In my case, it was none of the above. I'm a federal investigator, have been for almost 20 years. Bureau of Land Management and Environmental Crimes Division, to be specific. I've spent my life knee-deep in fraud cases involving stolen land grants, illegal zoning deals, and crooked HOA schemes stretching from Nevada to the Carolinas. It's not glamorous, but I know how to read people, how to follow paper trails, and more importantly, how to sit quietly in the weeds while a corrupt system hangs itself with its own rules. After years of chasing cases across state lines, I finally took a short sabbatical, a break I was long overdue for, and came out to the lake property my grandfather built by hand back in the 70s. It was a place I remembered from childhood. nights under the stars, crackling firewood, and the smell of pine drifting through every window. When my father passed, the deed came to me and I knew I'd someday return, not to escape life but to live it on my own terms if only for a while. The problem was the area around the lake had changed. Big time. What used to be old ranch land and scattered cabins had turned into a playground for rich retirees, weekend investors and self-righteous committees with too much time and too little sense. The Lakeside Ridge Homeowners Association was formed by a bunch of these transplants. People who bought properties they didn't understand, then immediately set about trying to modernize and protect the community. That meant rewriting boundaries, building security fences, issuing noise ordinances, even trying to set architectural standards for cabins that had been standing longer than most of them had been alive. And that's where Karen came in. Her real name was Susan Marie Covington, but no one called her that anymore. She was Karen to the bone. Tight curls dyed too yellow, permanent frown etched between her eyebrows, a voice that could strip bark from trees. She'd been the HOA president for almost a year and wielded that title like a medieval scepter. From what I gathered, she moved in after a divorce, bought a corner lot lake house with her alimony, and made it her personal mission to whip the neighborhood into submission. She didn't care that my cabin wasn't technically inside the HOA boundaries. She insisted it was part of their expanded lakefront management plan, which had never been legally approved but was loudly declared in every email she blasted to the residents. Most people were either too intimidated or too apathetic to challenge her. Not me. See, people like Karen don't just crave power, they thrive on the idea that no one will push back. They speak with such certainty, wear rules like armor, and expect others to cave because conflict is uncomfortable. But when your job involves walking into boardrooms where million-dollar fraud is buried under polite smiles and designer suits, you learn how to handle a Karen without blinking. The few neighbors I did speak to when I first arrived, folks like old Mr. Harlan 2 lots over, or the newlywed Thompsons with their twin labs, had warned me. Keep your permits close and your doors locked, Mr. Harlan had grunted over his fishing rod. She once fined me for painting my shed too dark. I'd chuckled at the time, thinking it couldn't be that bad. But it got worse fast. Karen didn't like that I didn't respond to her welcome packet. She didn't like that I didn't attend her monthly Zoom meetings or pay voluntary association support dues. And she especially didn't like that I parked my government SUV with the plate tags turned outward like a middle finger to her domain. I wasn't trying to provoke her, but I wasn't about to bend either. The land was mine. The title was clean. The cabin was legal. And I had every right to be there. Still, Karen treated my presence like a personal challenge. She'd show up uninvited, clipboard in hand, acting like a sheriff in some HOA Wild West, citing fake regulations and quoting non-existent bylaws like scripture. At first, I ignored her, chalking it up to boredom or control issues. But when she started bringing other board members around, guys in polos and boat shoes nodding along with every ridiculous claim, I knew this wasn't just about me. Karen wasn't just a busybody. She was building something. A power base. An illusion of control. And she was more than willing to trample anyone who threatened it. What she didn't realize was that by targeting me she hadn't picked the wrong man, she picked the worst possible one. It started with a note. Not a formal letter or an email, just a smug little post it slapped on my door like a kindergarten tattletale with a god complex. You are in violation of Community Code 3.7, unauthorized occupancy. Report to the HOA board for review. President Covington. No phone number. No legal reference. Just a handwritten signature and an underlined smiley face that somehow made it feel more threatening than polite. I stood there on my porch for a good 5 minutes just staring at it, coffee going cold in my hand, trying to decide whether to laugh or tear the damn thing up. Occupancy violation? On private land with a clean deed, surveyed and documented? I thought maybe she was confused, or bluffing. So I wrote a quick, firm note in return. This property is outside of HOA jurisdiction. Please refrain from unauthorized contact. Thank you. I taped it back to my door and went about my day. I wish that had been the end of it. But with Karen's, one boundary crossed is just an invitation to cross 10 more. The next week, I found a flyer under my windshield wiper. An invitation to a mandatory compliance hearing at the community center. All residents in violation of shared use agreements must attend or risk fines and forced mediation. I rolled my eyes, crumpled the flyer, and tossed it. She was escalating, clearly, but she had no legal grounds. The problem was Karen wasn't working alone anymore. She'd started rallying her little band of rule-happy followers, a rotating cast of retirees and amateur enforcers who had nothing better to do than make themselves feel important. One afternoon, I came back from a supply run to find 3 strangers pacing near the edge of my dock, clipboards in hand, pointing at the boathouse and muttering like stormtroopers studying rebel blueprints. "Excuse me," I called out, stepping out of the truck. "This is private land. Who gave you permission to be here?" One of them, a wiry guy with a sun visor and a pink shirt that said HOA Enforcement Volunteer, smiled without warmth. "We're conducting a routine shoreline assessment," he said. "For safety and uniformity. It's all part of the Lakefront Beautification Initiative." "Is this initiative funded or backed by the county?" I asked. "Do you have a warrant? A permit? A brain between the 3 of you?" That didn't go over well. They stormed off muttering about non-compliance, and I knew then I was officially in her crosshairs. The next week brought the first formal letter, printed on HOA letterhead and delivered not by mail, but hand-dropped on my porch like a mafia threat. "You are occupying a structure without community board approval. Please vacate the premises within 14 days to avoid legal action." I scanned it and laughed. She actually had the nerve to cite a zoning statute that didn't exist, and even misquoted a state code that hadn't applied to our district in over 10 years. It would have been funny if it weren't so dangerous. I knew from years of experience that people like Karen rarely understood the systems they tried to manipulate. But in their ignorance, they could still create a paper trail that turned into real damage: property liens, police involvement, and years of legal hell. So I called the county registrar to confirm once again that I was in the clear. The official, an old colleague, ironically, laughed when I read him the letter. "You're clean. Always have been," he said. "They've tried this on 3 other legacy cabins. It's a harassment tactic. They hope you'll sell just to get them off your back." And that's when something in me snapped, not out of fear but out of principle. I didn't come out here to play politics with power-hungry volunteers. I came out here to find peace, to reconnect with something real, something earned. But instead, I'd walked into a low-level war with an HOA president who fancied herself a dictator. Karen wasn't just trying to evict me. She was trying to erase me. And if she wanted a fight, then fine. She was about to find out that the man in the cabin wasn't just a name on a deed. I was the one thing she couldn't scare off with letters, fines, or fake authority. I was trained for this, and I was just getting started. If the fake citations and compliance letters had been the first wave, what came next was a full-blown siege. It began with Karen stationing one of her HOA henchmen, Greg, a retired insurance auditor with the charisma of a wet sock, at the edge of my driveway. I noticed him one morning just standing there, arms crossed, pretending to monitor lake traffic, but really watching my every move like he was auditioning for a bad spy movie. I gave him a friendly wave at first, hoping to shame him into some semblance of decency, but he just stared back, notebook in hand, as if logging the way I loaded firewood into my truck was part of some critical security operation. A few days later, a bright yellow notice appeared nailed to my fence post. Yes, nailed, declaring my boathouse unfit for shared use compliance, and warning of a $250 fine per day until it was removed or brought into aesthetic alignment with neighborhood standards. The language was so vague and legal-sounding that it could have fooled a less experienced homeowner. But I wasn't just a homeowner, I was a federal investigator who'd prosecuted guys like Greg and Karen for manipulating exactly this kind of administrative theater. Still, it stung. Not because of the threat, but because of what it represented. They were willing to lie, to invent violations out of thin air, just to make my life harder. And they weren't done. That weekend, I returned from a hike to find a group of HOA volunteers standing on my property line with measuring tapes, cameras, and a dog-eared binder labeled Enforcement Phase 2. When I asked them what they were doing, a stern woman named Linda told me they were documenting structural encroachments and potential violations of fire code setback regulations. "This land isn't even zoned under your HOA, I said, pointing to the survey marker that clearly showed my property's boundary. "You have no jurisdiction here." But they didn't care. They took pictures anyway, citing some nonsense about unified visual character and provisional oversight authority, granted by a vote I never participated in. It was like watching a group of hall monitors try to seize control of a military base using a plastic whistle and a clipboard. That same night, my power flickered out. Not for long, just a minute, but long enough to set off alarms. I checked the breaker box and found it had been tampered with. There were scratches on the lock, and one of the switches had been flipped manually. I knew it couldn't be a coincidence. Karen was pushing this thing into new territory, past policy disputes and into direct intimidation. And still, she wasn't satisfied. A week later, I received a certified letter, this one from a law office 3 counties away. It was a cease and desist order, accusing me of unlawful occupation, visual pollution, and threatening the cohesive identity of the community. It would have been laughable if it weren't signed by an actual attorney, someone Karen had roped into her crusade. The letter gave me 7 days to vacate or face legal consequences. My hands clenched around the paper as I read it. Not because I was scared, but because now it was official. Karen was going all in. She wanted me out, and she wasn't afraid to weaponize every loophole, every falsehood, every contact in her little network of bored retirees and part-time paralegals. I tried for a moment to imagine what kind of person wakes up and decides to ruin someone else's peace because a log cabin doesn't match the pastel color scheme of their HOA newsletter. I couldn't. But I knew I had to make a choice. Either keep reacting, defending myself letter by letter, or take the offensive and end this nonsense for good. Before that, though, I made one last attempt to settle things peacefully. I called the HOA office, really just a glorified desk at the community center, and left a message asking to speak with Karen directly. To my surprise, she called back that evening, voice syrupy with fake politeness. "Oh, I'm so glad you reached out," she said. "I was worried you weren't taking our notices seriously." I told her plainly that her actions were out of bounds, that her claims had no legal merit, and that if this harassment continued, I'd be forced to respond through official channels. There was a pause, then a scoff. "You're not special," she said. "Just because you have a badge doesn't mean you're above the rules. We make the rules out here." And there it was, her true belief laid bare. She didn't just think she was enforcing policy. She believed she was the law. That's when I knew talk was useless. Karen didn't need an explanation, she needed a lesson. And I was ready to teach it. The moment she uttered those words, "We make the rules out here," something clicked. Not in anger, not even frustration. It was clarity, pure and sharp. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. Karen had deluded herself into thinking the HOA was its own government, one she presided over like a lakefront monarch. And if that's how she wanted to play, then it was time to introduce her to what real law and jurisdiction looked like. For weeks, I tolerated her antics, letting her dig her own pit with phony citations and unauthorized inspections. But now, I opened my field laptop and began documenting everything: scanned copies of her letters, photos of the trespassing volunteers, the tampered breaker box, audio recordings of her threatening call. I wasn't just gathering evidence, I was building a case. And I didn't need to bluff. I had the credentials, the jurisdiction, and the legal expertise to expose her for what she was: a civilian pretending to hold power she never earned. I spent the next few days methodically preparing. First, I cross-referenced HOA boundary filings with the county recorder's office. Just as I expected, there had never been an expansion voted on or recorded. Karen's lakefront management plan was nothing but a PowerPoint fantasy she'd cooked up and force-fed to compliant residents. Then I pulled all registered complaints she and her board had filed against other legacy property owners. There were 12. 12 families, mostly elderly, who had been harassed into either selling, repainting, or modifying their homes based on entirely fabricated standards. Most had no idea they could have fought back. They just didn't have the time, energy, or legal know-how to resist. I spoke to 3 of them, off the record, and every story was the same: intimidation, fake hearings, threats of liens, or fines that were never backed by real statutes. Karen had created a system built on fear and assumption. And like every corrupt system, all it took was one well-placed push to bring it down. My plan wasn't complicated, but it would be thorough. I compiled a report, over 70 pages long, complete with attachments, timestamps, and GPS-tagged photos. I filed it directly to the county commissioner's office and CC'd 2 departments I had worked with previously: environmental zoning and rural property oversight. Then I called a few trusted contacts at the local sheriff's department and let them know what was coming. Not as a threat, but a heads-up. I wanted this clean, official, and above board. The final piece was making my presence known. No more quiet days on the porch. That Saturday, I held a landowner's cookout, invited every neighbor within shouting distance, and stood in front of my cabin in full agency uniform. Not tactical gear, just the official field jacket, badge visible, and my ID prominently displayed on the grill table. The message was clear: I wasn't hiding. I wasn't bluffing. And I wasn't going anywhere. Karen showed up 20 minutes in, trying to act casual in her floral blouse and fake smile, but the moment she saw the badge and the crowd listening to me explain their rights as landowners, she went stiff as a fence post. "You're politicizing this," she hissed when she pulled me aside. "You're turning neighbors against each other." "No," I replied, calmly flipping a burger. "You did that when you started impersonating a legal authority. I'm just helping people remember they don't have to live under your thumb. She left in a huff, but I knew the damage was done. The illusion she had built, that she was untouchable, that her word was law, was unraveling fast. And the best part? I hadn't raised my voice once. I didn't need to. Because while Karen clung to her fake power, I was wielding the real thing, with facts, law, and the very system she thought she could manipulate. Now all that remained was to watch her castle of clipboard threats collapse under the weight of her own arrogance. It all came crashing down faster than I expected. Just 3 days after submitting my report, the county sent an inspector, an actual, uniformed official with a clipboard that actually meant something. His name was McAdams, a no-nonsense type I'd worked with in the past on 2 land fraud cases. He knocked on my cabin door at 9 a.m. sharp, coffee in one hand, official seal in the other. "Got your file?" he said with a grin. "Read it twice. This HOA's about to have a very long week." We walked the property line together, and I pointed out everything Karen's crew had done: tampering with my breaker box, trespassing without permits, illegal signage, unauthorized citations, and bogus structural complaints. McAdams took photos, made notes, and nodded a lot. He especially enjoyed the part where I showed him a printed email from Karen's group titled Operation Occupier, their internal code name for their plan to reclaim my cabin. He let out a low whistle. "This is gold. You realize what this is, right? Attempted land encroachment, possible mail fraud, impersonation of legal authority." I nodded. "And intimidation. Multiply that by every homeowner she's harassed, and you've got yourself a racketeering pattern." He left with a thick stack of evidence, promising follow-up in less than 48 hours. I didn't have to wait long. That Thursday morning I was on the porch again, same chair, same mug, when the convoy arrived. 2 sheriff cruisers. 1 county assessor. And behind them, an official black Suburban from the Department of Rural Affairs. Karen's Mercedes wasn't far behind, no doubt summoned by her panicked board members who'd been caught completely flat-footed. She marched out of her SUV like a general arriving late to her own war, heels clacking, phone in hand, and her face already flushed with fury. "What is the meaning of this?" she barked, storming toward the sheriff's deputy. "This is private HOA business. You can't just barge into our affairs without cause." That's when I stood up and walked over, my own badge now clipped clearly to my belt. The moment she saw it again, this time accompanied by a government vehicle and multiple witnesses, she froze. "You made this official when you impersonated authority and interfered with private landowners," I said calmly. "You're not a law enforcement officer. You're not a zoning official. And you certainly don't have the right to trespass, fine, or threaten people off their own land." She blinked rapidly, mouth opening like she had something to say, but no words came out. The deputy spoke next, firm and clear. "Ma'am, we have multiple reports and photographic evidence of overreach, falsified citations, and harassment. We're going to need you to come with us for questioning." Her eyes widened. "This is ridiculous. He's lying, he's not even really a Fed, he's just pretending, already verified through official channels," McAdams said, stepping forward with a copy of my credentials. "He's the real deal. You're the one playing sheriff." The look on her face was something I'll never forget. Part horror, part disbelief, like a movie villain suddenly realizing the hero has been recording the entire conversation. She stammered something about needing to call her lawyer, but it didn't matter. The cuffs came out. They didn't arrest her then and there, but they detained her for obstruction and brought her in for questioning. The board members who had backed her up so confidently just days earlier scattered like leaves in a windstorm. The HOA's inbox, I later heard, flooded with angry emails from residents who'd finally learned the truth. And the cherry on top? That mandatory occupancy hearing she'd scheduled for me? Canceled. The entire panel dissolved within the week. I never raised my voice. Never threw a punch. Never threatened anyone. I just used what Karen never expected. Real authority backed by real law. The satisfaction wasn't loud or cinematic. It was quiet, deep. Watching her drive away in the back of that cruiser, knowing she was about to face real accountability for the empire of paper threats she'd built, gave me a peace far deeper than any confrontation could. For the first time since arriving at my grandfather's cabin, I felt something settle in my chest. Not just victory. Justice. In the days that followed Karen's detainment, the entire neighborhood seemed to exhale all at once, like a long-held breath was finally released. The mood shifted tangibly, less paranoia, more porch lights glowing at dusk, neighbors waving again, conversations blooming in driveways without a clipboard hovering in the background. It was almost strange at first, seeing people come out of their homes without fear of being documented, cited, or shamed for having the wrong color shutters or hosting too many grandkids on the weekend. Word of what had happened traveled fast. Within 48 hours, the HOA board dissolved its enforcement committee entirely, claiming they were undergoing restructuring, though everyone knew that was code for ducking legal fallout. Karen's name was quietly removed from the HOA website, her title replaced with a vague interim oversight pending. No apology. No statement. Just silence where once there had been constant, caps-locked emails. And yet, in that silence, something beautiful started to grow. Old Mr. Harlan from 2 lots down brought over a bottle of bourbon and laughed for the first time in years. "Didn't think I'd live to see the day," he said, lifting his glass. "Been wanting to paint my shed red since 2012. The Thompsons hosted a lakeside barbecue, no permits, no guilt, just music, grilled corn, and half the neighborhood showing up to celebrate the return of common sense. People began digging out lawn chairs that had once been deemed aesthetic violations, restoring old handmade signs, and even planting wildflowers instead of those sterile HOA-approved shrubs. It was like someone had ripped off a suffocating plastic wrap and finally let the community breathe again. As for Karen, the county officially charged her with several counts: misuse of regulatory authority, impersonating a legal official, and in one particularly ironic twist, environmental disturbance, due to the unauthorized patrols she'd ordered along the protected lakefront. Last I heard, she'd lawyered up and was trying to shift blame to overzealous volunteers. But the paper trail was too thick, too damning. My report, along with testimonies from a half-dozen residents, had left no room for spin. She was done, at least in this neighborhood. I didn't revel in her downfall. That's not why I did it. I didn't expose Karen to humiliate her or to stroke my ego or even for revenge. Though I'll admit the look on her face when I showed her the badge will be burned into my memory forever. No, I did it because I believe in lines. Not just on maps or deeds or legal documents, but moral lines, the ones you don't cross just because you think no one's looking. Karen crossed those lines gleefully, assuming no one would push back. She believed power came from asserting it loudly rather than earning it quietly. And I've spent enough of my life in the gray spaces of enforcement to know how dangerous that kind of unchecked confidence can be. The cabin, my grandfather's cabin, stood unchanged through it all, strong and steady.